So I'm planning on selling my property. However, I'm not sure if I should actually leave my tenants there.
Well, I want to buy a property and it's tenanted. So the estate agent was like, this is a perfect opportunity for investors. So what should I look out for? Hello, everybody. You are tuned into Know Wealth. My name is Nell.
And my name is Lebu.
So today we're looking at this from the buyer side and also the seller side. From the buyer side being it that when I'm buying a property with the tenant in, what should I look out for, right? And then from the seller side is that I want to sell my property, but I have a tenant in. So how do I go about that?
So let's start with the one of actually leaving the tenant in that particular property. Now, do you think that it's wise for someone to actually leave a tenant in that property?
I mean, looking at you selling that property, it can either go both ways. Because now when you have a tenant in, you're already shaving off a specific market whereby somebody would be wanting to buy that property to live in. So what does that mean? Is that it does mean that you're searching for investors. And not just any investor, an investor who already wants a tenant in that place, because some investors are quite tricky. I remember us with our engagements with investors, some guys were like, I do not want to inherit a tenant. So what this means is that your target market or people that will be willing to buy the property that you have will be slightly smaller. So you don't want your regular person who wants to buy the house. It's not that person. It's also not an investor who wants to buy a property that has a tenant in. And then with your thoughts, Lem?
I mean, even when you're actually zooming in terms of the target market that you are actually looking at. Say, for instance, you have a property and it's a unit, right? It's a one unit. So now if you're looking at leaving your tenant in that particular property, already you're shaving off that you're only looking at property investors. You're also shaving off what type of property investor you're actually getting. So now there are other people that are saying that, you know what, I want to actually buy a property that has tenants. However, I'm looking at buying houses. And then there are other people that are saying that I want to buy units. So now basically means that you have actually shaven off a lot of people from that particular market. So now that's something that you need to understand, that if I'm actually going to be leaving my tenants there, that's something that they should consider. And also the law in South Africa actually states that you can't just let go of the tenant. So now if I'm going to be buying this property, I'm also inheriting the tenants, which means that I'm also inheriting the lease agreement. So now it's important for you to understand that if I'm actually going to be leaving this lease agreement to someone, what rules and regulations do I actually have on my lease agreement? If it's just your regular lease agreement that you actually get at some shops, right? It's only 5 pages. A real property investor will tell you that I don't actually use this lease agreement. So now those are the things that you actually need to consider before you sell the property with the tenants inside.
It's a very emotional process, especially when you've had these tenants for so many years in your property. You've had that good relationship. However, when you are looking at it as a property investor, this is business, right? So you'll be like, I think I should move on to another property, or I'm ready to sell. So now how your tenants will be looking at you will be like, why do you really need to sell this property? Because we've been having such a good relationship with yourself and the property. And now you as a property investor need to look at this from all angles, because last thing you want is getting somebody involved. I like what Lebo mentions, getting somebody involved, the new buyer, not understanding the terms and conditions. So please be aware of the terms and conditions that you do have with your tenants, whether it's a month to month, or whether it's a 6-month contract, or whether it's a 1-year contract. So what you need to do is that before you even draft the contract, look where you are in terms of your property journey and the possibility of selling. So if there is a high possibility that you want to sell, last thing you want is actually having a 10-year contract with your tenant. So look at that, and how does that actually factor into when you're about to sell? Because last thing you want is putting yourself in that position whereby we did mention that there are less buyers that are available for your property in particular.
So now the second point that I would actually like to speak about is that how is your moral campus standing, right? So now with a lot of property investors, what they'll then do is that if I have a tenant inside, I'll just tell the estate agent to sell it without the tenants actually knowing. And then once the property is actually sold, that's when I'm actually going to be telling the tenants that, okay, you need to vacate my property within the next 2 months, right? So now something that you need to understand is that once you start bringing in people over and over again, the tenants are going to know that this property is actually being sold, because you can't say that it's a evaluation and you have 16 different people that are coming to view your property. So make sure that you do make them understand that I'm going to be selling my property and I'm actually looking for an investor to come actually buy this property. Once they do understand that, then they are more likely to let the people come view, because they do understand that this property is about to get sold.
100%. So now let's look at it from a perspective whereby I'm the buyer now, and what's happening now? What power do I have when it comes to inheriting tenants? So I've noticed, especially with our conversations with other property investors, it's actually divided by two. Some people do prefer to inherit, whereas other people don't prefer to inherit. So let's look at the people that don't prefer to inherit. So somebody who doesn't want to inherit, they're looking at it rather from, you know what, I'm new in the game, especially I'm new in this property, and I'd like to actually make sure that everything does go through me. So the selecting of that person who be living there, I want to know for sure where their credit status is, and am I truly happy with this person? So it's more about a control game. So when you're inheriting, it's more of whoever who's in there has been there, and then you are jumping into a moving train. So some people don't want that. They actually want to make sure that they did have the control in terms of choosing the person who's living in that property. And then for you, Lev, your thoughts about that?
So I'll give my thoughts based on the people that actually want to have or to inherit the tenants, right? So now when you're looking at that particular procedure, once the property becomes transferred into your name, this basically means that the tenants now have to actually pay you. So you don't have that 1 month whereby you're going to leave the property vacant, because now the tenant is already there. So now what this basically means is that you are actually inheriting this tenant, you are inheriting the contract of this tenant, and you're also inheriting their lifestyle. So what do I mean by lifestyle? I mean that if they're able to actually pay their monthly rent on time, then that means that you also inherit that. However, if it's otherwise, then you know that you have a problem right there. So now what I like to actually tell property investors is that before inheriting a tenant, make sure that you understand who lives in that property. So now, making sure that you understand who lives in this property, you need to ask the estate agent for them to actually pull a TPN report on this particular people. You also need to pull your own TPN, because this might mean that this person has been living in this property for the past 10 years. However, in the past 5 years, they haven't actually been paying on time. So you need to make sure that you also pull a TPN report on that particular person. You need to see their bank statement and their payslip to make sure that this person is indeed actually in this particular property and they are actually paying rent on time. Because the last thing that you want to do is to inherit this tenant only to find out that that property investor is selling the property because that tenant is bad. And I remember there was a time whereby we went viewing on a property, and now the tenant hadn't actually paid rent for the past 3 months, right? So now if the tenant hasn't paid rent for the past 3 months, chances are when you actually buy this property and it gets transferred into your name, he won't actually be paying for the next 3 months. So always take that into consideration.
Especially as a young property investor. So you find yourself in a situation whereby the person who's living there is not really somebody who's enthusiastic about paying their bills. So that actually puts you in a difficult situation whereby you're dealing with somebody who's twice your age. That's a situation that we found ourselves in, and you have to know what you need to do very fast, because if they can sense that you do not know what you're doing, this is going to be the end of the road for you, because when it comes to eviction can take months. So you do want to not only seem as if you know what you're doing, you do have to know what you're doing when it comes to property investing. What weight does inheriting a tenant come with? So at the end of the day, it's up to you. You need to take a conscious decision as a property investor, and it needs to be summed up by facts. If you are inheriting a tenant, you already know that what you need to look out for, TPN. You already know that the pro is getting cash flow on month 1. However, you're also considering that if I'm not inheriting, I know that I have the power to actually make sure that I'm selecting that right person who will be qualified and who does actually suit my target market.
Make sure that you do understand who's in that property before you inherit that property. If you don't want to actually go through that whole stress, make sure that you're buying properties that don't have any tenants. So the decision is up to you at the end of the day. Do you buy the property with the tenant, or you don't buy the property without the tenant? And now make sure that when you are actually saying that you don't want to buy a property without a tenant, that is well stipulated in the contract, in the offer to purchase, that when you buy the property, you want it to be fully vacant. You don't want anybody living in that property.
And if you're quite confused about this whole process, to make it very easy, management companies are there to get the tenant, to vet the tenant, and also place the tenant. So in that way, there's no stress or there's no fuss for your side. You can actually own a property from the UK in South Africa, and it will be done on your behalf. It might take longer than you might have anticipated. However, it will be done the correct way, because we were also in the situation whereby, should I rather get a quick tenant? Should I rather fill a tenant in that I'm not sure about so that I can get rent and before end of the month? Or should I get the right tenant that will actually adhere to our rules? So yeah, that's it from our side. Hope you guys got so much value from this, and we're quite excited about this. If you haven't sent us an email for Cape Town, please make sure, because there's less than 15 seats. I'm sure it's about 10 seats. Secure your seat by emailing propertyevents@nongwealth.co.za.
No?
Signing out.